Welcome to the seventh and final talk on Germany between 1815 and 2015. What we're going to be looking at in this talk is about reunification. How did it occur? Why did it occur? When it did? And how do we look back on German history from the perspective of post-unification Germany? Well, we need to look first of all at the system that existed in the 1980s, prior to 1985. Basically, there was a Warsaw Pact system by which the Soviet Union kept close control over its client states in Eastern Europe, East Germany being one of these. And there are three pillars in this Soviet system. First of all, the principle of Soviet military domination. And basically meant that they had to have security of the region. We have to remember that Russia and the Soviet Union were invaded twice and involved in two bloody wars on its own soil between 1914-18 and 41-45. And so they wanted to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. Secondly, there was the idea of the socialist command economy. The state dictated what had to be made rather than the market. And finally, the sole rule of the Communist Party. So basically, it was about a dictatorship in terms of politics, in terms of the economy, and in terms of foreign policy. This began to change when this man became General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party in 1985 in the Soviet Union. He put forward that, or he certainly realised that the Soviet Union was in need of radical reform. He was one of the youngest General Secretaries and put forward two clear ways of bringing about this reform. One was glasnost and one was perestroika. One meant openness and the other one meant restructuring. Openness to other ideas, restructuring of the economy. So, how did this come about? Well, this began slowly but certainly gained more and more steam as the time went on throughout the 80s. So in 1986, an amnesty was given to Polish prisoners after the military coup in Poland in 1980, where the Polish army took over because of growing unrest with separate non-socialist trade unions, more specifically Solidarity. In 1988, Gorbachev closed down the Central Committee Department responsible for centralising the communist parties in Eastern Europe. So in other words, what that meant was that each communist party in each of the countries in the Eastern Bloc, in the Warsaw Pact, could start to determine their own path to socialism. And in December 1988, Gorbachev renounces the threat of force as a form of foreign policy. In other words, if the parties wish to become much more democratic, those states become much more democratic, then that is the path that they could choose. No longer could they invade with using tanks, such as happened in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, East Germany in 1954, in Poland in 1980. In April 1989, Soviet troops began to withdraw from Hungary. And Hungary then decides in May that it becomes to defortify its border with Austria, so it starts to become an open border. That meant throughout the summer of 1989, the people from East Germany could go for holidays into Hungary and then claim asylum at the Austrian consulate there, get a visa to go over the Hungarian-Austrian border, go to Austria, and then through Austria go to West Germany. And this became a trickle and then became a flood. Large numbers of people were moving from East Germany to West Germany, but not directly over the border, but through a more roundabout ways. In October 1989 was the 40th anniversary of the GDR. Gorbachev says there, life punishes those who come too late. And it's just at that point that there was a great deal more protest. But that becomes more and more apparent later on in October and especially in November. A great deal of marches are taking place, not specifically in Berlin to begin with, but in Dresden and more especially Leipzig. where more and more people are coming into the city, which started off in the churches, and it becomes from hundreds to thousands when they realise that the Stasi and the military weren't going to open fire on them. In the 9th of November, of course, what we see is the Berlin Wall coming down. And in fact, it was almost by accident. Obviously, I mentioned that there was an easing of travel restrictions between Hungary and Austria, but this became also the case between the GDR and West Germany. This was only happened because in a press conference in Berlin, the SED chief Gunter Schabowski mistakenly announced the border crossings would be open with immediate effect. He sort of burbled it out, and immediately people took him at his word and started to cross. And that was it. Nothing else could happen to stop them. Thousands of Berliners flocked to the wall. Border guards had no choice but to let them through. Ecstatic scenes around the wall. These Berliners welcome to the West. Potential problems quickly became apparent. The opening of the border between East and West meant there was now no turning back for the GDR. There were different ideas, though, where the GDR should go. Initially, we have the not so much party, but what they call themselves were forums, democratic councils of peoples, almost a bit like Soviets, I suppose, whereby they said that they wanted the GDR to continue, but to become more and more democratic. We are the people, we are one people. However, this became less and less likely as more and more people went to the West, saw what was offered there, and wanted that. Although, as I say, in December 1989, that was the dominant idea. And there's a list of things, how things changed very, very rapidly, so that although it says free elections in May, it was actually March 1990, there would be free elections in March 1990, and the SED becomes just one party in a competition for the elections to the East German Parliament. And in the March elections, the main parties that win are the Alliance for Germany, dominated by the CDU. That's the East German CDU, not the West German CDU. The next major party was the SPD. And as a result of that, you begin to get the movement towards reunification. So the CDU-dominated Alliance for Germany won the most seats and formed a grand coalition with the Social Democrats and Liberals. First thing that needed to happen was some form of economic alliance with West, and so a currency reform saw the Deutschmark being adopted by the East. And then there was a realisation that the East German state was no longer viable, and so there had to be some form of reunification. As I said before, this really meant taking over. It wasn't just up to East and West Germany. The greater powers, the USA, USSR, Britain and France, had to agree to this, and they did this on the 1st and 2nd of October. Midnight on the 2nd and 3rd of October, the black and red gold flag raised in front of the Reichstag building in Berlin, and the GDR was formally abolished. So what was Germany like after 1990? The speed of reunification brought its own problems. There was a major disparity between East and West. Most of the companies which were state-owned in the East were basically very, very inefficient, had very old machinery, and basically they were shut down, which led to a great deal of unemployment. As a result, a tax had to be imposed on the West to help pay for the East, which initially in the euphoria people agreed to, but this continued, and people felt that the East was just draining the money out of the West, and to some extent they saw the East as just being lazy. And there began to be not so much conflict, but certainly Easterners and Westerners saw each other as different, describing each other as either Ossis, which meant people in the East, or Westies, people in the West. And there were stereotypes as Ossis basically being wanting state handouts, being lazy, and Westies as they were known as elbows, people who always pushed themselves to the front, irrespective of where they were in the queue. There was a rise of nostalgia, as I mentioned before. There was also the need for de-Stasification, which meant that all the Files on individuals that had been spied on throughout the whole period had to be opened up, and people started to realise who had been spying on them. And this could be friends, it could be neighbours, it could be family members, it could be your wife, it could be your best friend, it could be your father. And therefore large numbers of people, families were breaking up and friendships were being destroyed. There was a fear, especially in the east, of extreme right rising, although this became unfounded to some extent in the 90s. And then later on in the 90s, Berlin was decided to be on as the capital of the United Germany, and this came about with the restored Reichstag building becoming the German Parliament. This led to in the 2000s to a renewed confidence involvement in international politics. Basically, Germany is seen as the key mover and shaker in the European Union. Now we're just going to very quickly look at interpretations. One way of seeing it is the Sonderweg, the special way, that somehow Germany was always destined to become a dictatorship at some point. And this could be seen in its political, economic and military successes were down to unique values and institutions. This was seen as a negative thing in post-45, the fact that somehow Germany took a wrong turn, and the way that this is interpreted was that there was a failed middle class revolution in the 1840s. From that they retreated and left the conservative elites to take over politically. However, this was challenged in the 1980s by saying, well, they might have done that, but they were dominated culture and society. The middle classes dominated culture, society, and to some extent the economy too. Related to the debate of the Sonderweg is the issue of continuities in modern German history. In the 40s and 50s, West German and American historians saw the Third Reich as a result of the flaws in the German. In other words, the continuity went directly to the Third Reich, while the West German historians saw it as an aberration, the consequence of wider European trends. In other words, you can't isolate the Third Reich as something uniquely German when there were other dictatorships, totalitarian dictatorships happening in Italy and in Russia at the same time. Fischer, another famous German historian, created controversy and new debate on the Sonderweg, led to the structuralist historians identifying and highlighting continuities between the imperial period of the Wilhelminian Germany between 1890 and 1918 and the Third Reich. Undoubtedly there are similarities, no period of history is divorced from what precedes it, but this approach can be misleading. Hindsight shouldn't mislead us into assuming that the course of history was fixed. In fact, how do you explain the fact that the Weimar Republic came into being and that West Germany, eventually the unified Germany, is a democratic and a solidly democratic state? Another way of looking at it is in terms of geography, that the fact that it is in the middle of Europe, looking both east and west, meant it was vulnerable to attack and therefore had to defend itself. And this was done through military means, through the Prussian military monarchy. It was always surrounded by enemies, and therefore it always had a military element to its outlook. Martin Kitchen, a British historian, said that geography had a psychological effect on the Germans, nationalism the result of a jealous hatred of the West, and an arrogant disdain for the East. And finally, there is a historical argument. Germany's fractured and fragmented history is the key to understanding its development in the 20th century. Germany became a nation-state comparatively late, which led to the development of unstable national consciousness and national inferiority complex. But after 1871, this became an assertive nationalism, and that this led eventually to Nazism. However, the fact that you need to look at different types of Germanies, i.e. through looking at the revival of federalism, is the key also of looking at the many different paths could have been taken, as there were many different Germanies going back in time.